James Sowerby. Okay, he was a remarkable man. He was remarkable because he had a driven desire to discover natural history. And he was also remarkable because he had a great desire to communicate about that natural history to everybody. He was also remarkable for the quality and for the quantity of his output and his contribution, a contribution that still lives on to this day. And my book is just the story about that man, and also about his times, and really it's just to tell you that my thesis is simply this, that it is worth knowing about. Especially, I could perhaps add, if you're interested in the history of science, if you're interested in art with science. Let's just put him into perspective. He was born about 20 years before Linnaeus' death, and he died about, well, let me see, about 13 years after Charles Darwin's birth. And so we're talking about a period of great, almost burgeoning of interest and research in natural history. Significant number of flora were written. Cook had been on his voyages, of course. A great deal was happening in that time. New Holland or Australia was being opened up. But there weren't, the interesting point about this too is that Sowerby was living at a time when there was a very influential and important president of the Royal Society, Joseph Banks, who was a botanist who had his own extensive herbarium. And he was wealthy. He had, as we all probably all know here in this room, he had a great deal of influence in what actually happened about natural history. He was almost a friend, I would say, of King George III, and he became de facto director of Kew Gardens. And the fact that he was a supporter of Sowerby pretty early on, I think was a significant benefit to Sowerby indeed. Let me just mention quickly, I have to skate over a lot of things because I haven't got very long, but his father, Sowerby's father, was a lapidary selling gems, cut stones and so on, just off Fleet Street. But unfortunately he died when Sowerby was only 9 years of age. Sowerby himself revealed an early artistic talent. It seemed to be just in his genes, really. He had an apprenticeship to Richard Wright, painter of marine scenes, sort of billowing ships on the ocean. But that was cut short through the early death of the master. He was a student of the Royal Academy Schools, and the Royal Academy Schools had not been open very long, so he was an early beneficiary of that. And he had to, in fact, have considerable skills to even enter there if he wasn't going to have to pay a fee. So he came in free of charge, as it were. And Andrea is coming in free of charge now, so that's good. Andrea is coming in free of charge. But the essential point I just need to make in skimming over this whole business of his early life is that he had the strong need to earn his own living. He had to make his way in the world. He was an artisan. He could have been a journeyman. What is he actually most famous for? If you talk about James Sowerby, most people say, it's this. 36 volumes comprising nearly 2,600 hand-coloured engravings of English botany. And if you look on the spine, it says Sowerby's English Botany. And all the volumes that were probably bound at the completion of the series in 1814 say Sowerby's English Botany, even though the author of the text was, for the most part, James Edward Smith. But James Edward Smith had been a bit huffy about having his name on the first serial parts, because this was Sowerby's project. Sowerby was an artisan. Sowerby was somebody who was starting to run a business. He was not perhaps necessarily seen as a botanist of a scientific caliber that perhaps people like Smith and others would deem necessary. So Smith might be argued to be a bit iffy, almost a bit prejudiced. Tom Kennett is in the audience, I'm pleased to see tonight, who is publishing a book soon, and we'll be talking later to the Linnean Society about James Edward Smith. I'll be interested to hear his interpretation on that. But why was I hooked? Because botany is not my field. I was on sabbatical in Cambridge for a while, and I walked into an antiquarian bookshop, and on the shelf there were the 5 volumes of British Mineralogy. I'd never seen this before. It comprises some 550 plates of minerals, engravings, hand-coloured. It's no easy job, actually, to draw and colour minerals. They're very difficult. It's much easier to photograph them in any guidebook. This was a remarkable book because it not only actually depicts minerals very well, it also says something about their origins, about their localities of collection, and some of their properties. And I wondered then, who is this man? Why is there nothing like this that's comparable? Why haven't I, as it were, seen it before? And then, quite a lot later, of course, because I didn't have time to pursue it then, I delved into the rich archives and sources of the libraries of the NHM, the Linnean Society here, of course, of Kew, Bristol University, British Library, and so on. The library of the NHM bought a lot of the letters, manuscripts, original drawings, and so on from the Sowerby family, as well as a lot of specimens. Similarly, the library here has got Smith's correspondence with Sowerby and a lot of wealth of material. And it surprised me at the time that a lot of this material just had not been looked at properly, certainly as far as Sowerby is concerned. And when you do look at it, you see that it is a story of achievement, of discovery, and also of prejudice, of challenge and of beauty. And the interesting bit is science in action, and science in action with art and science. And as I've said, I was surprised there's no existing biography and felt rather challenged to write one. So that's my story today, but my story has to be very curtailed because I'm only going to be speaking from, I don't know, 30 minutes more. And there's not much I can say. So I'm going to emphasize really some of the outputs that Sowerby himself made. If you look at a plant, an engraving, a hand-coloured engraving done by Sowerby, you might be impressed by its elegance. You might be impressed by its simplicity. You might also, if you're a taxonomist, be impressed by its taxonomic accuracy. Sowerby has managed to dispose the plant within the frame of the page. He has curved the leaf. He has cut the stem. For me, I found that beautiful, and I find it taxonomically significant, even though I am not a botanist. But I'll come back to how taxonomically significant it is in just a second. But how did he come to do that particular picture? And there are the people early in his life that were significantly influential. William Curtis, a botanist, and the Prefectus Horti at the Chelsea Physic Garden, or Prefectus Horti, I suppose, in modern day parliaments would be Chief Executive Officer, but I far prefer Prefectus Horti. He later had his own botanic garden at Lambeth. The essential thing was that Curtis, as many of us will know, was a communicator and author. He produced, among other things, but early on, in 1775, his Flora Londinensis, and some of this is on display in the library. It's a magnificent work that took many years, from 1775 to 98, very expensive to produce. The artists were Sowerby, Sydenham Edwards, and William Kilburn. For Sowerby, not only was he doing the artwork, but he had the benefits of travelling with Curtis 10 miles around London to collect specimens, and then to understand something about the botany, but also to learn something more about engraving techniques and colouring back at the ranch, as it were. This is one example of Sowerby's coloured engravings from the magnificent work on the folio plates of Deadly Nightshade that's on display in the library. This is another one that he did for the fungi in Flora Londinensis. It's an extremely expensive work these days. But for William Curtis, he was always in difficulty with financially. And as he famously said, Flora Londinensis brought him praise, but it didn't bring him money. It was too expensive with irregular publication and so on. So he started in 1787 the Botanical Magazine, which is still continuing to this day, as many of us will know. It became very successful, and so he was able to say it brought him pudding. It's octavo. It was regular. It was very accessible because it was communicated to the general people, not just to the botanists who were rather smart, perhaps. And he said about this particular orchid that I've got here, instead of writing a taxonomic description, Curtis, all he said was, our figure, the illustration by Sowerby, will make a description of the plant unnecessary. He sort of bunked out, really. Leave it to Sowerby to do the taxonomy. So he was highly influential. The other people that were perhaps influential were those who were beginning to realize that he was a potential contributor for the production of their fine books. Richard Salisbury, a vice president of this society, another botanist, wanted to publish his images of rare plants, but he saw that the only way that he could get any acclaim was that if he had fine illustrations. And so Sowerby would suddenly find a letter arriving to him at Lambeth. It is absolutely necessary for you to come down if I am to publish a fasciculus. Corrections and additions which can only be done by your incomparable pencil, his underlining. And that's the kind of result. And it's an impressive volume of beautiful illustrations. Of course, the name on the spine is not Sowerby. It's Salisbury only. But the value of the book, I would argue, is essentially the illustrations. Other commissions. The Marchioness Rockingham. Lady Rockingham was the wealthy widow of the Whig Prime Minister Watson Wentworth. She had a lot of money. She had a good garden, apparently. This kind of commission would arrive on Sowerby's door. I am desired by Lady Rockingham to say that her ladyship have a lilium in flower, which she wishes you to draw. If therefore you can come on Monday, it will be in a proper state. If, however, you cannot possibly come on Monday, I imagine Tuesday will do. She loved to put these paintings and so on her wall. There's a lot of correspondence which suggests that she was a pretty sort of influential, but rather perhaps attractive woman. But we don't have the paintings that he did of the lilium. There's another person that gave him commissions. To give you some examples of how his early life was framed, it's John Coakley Lettsome, a wealthy doctor, highly successful in London, who had a great estate at Grove Hill on the other side of the river near to Lambeth. Here he is in his garden. Let's just look at the status of some of these people. His garden had the greenhouse, the hothouse and laundry, stables, pleasure garden, kitchen garden, paddock, orchard, succession garden, arboretum or grove, pond and statue of Cupid, Sybil Temple, cold bath and basin, rotunda, and Shakespeare Walk with a statue. It's all very grand. And if you read the description of his library, it's even grander. Now, his garden, he was a social climber. He was also extremely effective, though, in his business. But he also had in his garden a botanical element to it. And so he displayed some of his specimens, his garden specimens, in Linnaeus's way. And he had then, it was probably no surprise to Sowerby that suddenly there would be a note through Sowerby's door which simply said, because let's face it, Sowerby was a relatively poor artisan, we're talking about relative to these people like Lettsome. When Mr. Sowerby can make it convenient to call upon me any Thursday or Tuesday from 4 to 7 afternoon, or Monday and Friday morning, I shall be glad to see him. This is the advantage of being able to get into the archives of the Naturalist in the Linnean Society and so on, because you get these snippets of social behaviour. You can't ever see this sort of thing in the published books. And of course, there was a commission. So this is the illustrated, hand-coloured illustration by Sowerby of an amaryllis in Lettsome's garden, or of a hedgehog lily. These are in the archives of the NHM. One of these days it would be lovely to see it published. Also in the archives, one comes across some of the original artwork by Sowerby. Here of a couple of plums with their lovely bloom and their colour, and a leaf slightly tinged with the green that the final print is going to have to be coloured in, together with some notes by Sowerby on the taste of the plum. And that results in that product in Driver's Pomona Britannica of 1788. So these were all the sorts of commissions that he was doing, as well as some that reflected things like the discoveries of life and so on in Australia and in other countries, that George Shaw, who was to be the future or he might have already been the keeper of natural history at the British Museum, published his Linnean Zoology in 1790, with many animals all drawn and coloured by Sowerby, this one of a Barbary ape. Interestingly, the systematists at that time liked to make some sort of generalised comments, such as, "We have fixed upon a species of ape sufficient to mortify the pride of mankind by the humiliating resemblance it bears to our own race." Actually, down at Kew the other day, we all rather agreed that the Barbary ape just needs a fag in his right hand. And Shaw also did the Zoology of New Holland, Australia, in 1794. There was a companion volume produced by James Edward Smith on the plants. Here were the animals. Here was Sowerby producing bird drawings, coloured bird drawings, the nonpareil parrot. And interestingly, again, the taxonomist, George Shaw, is content to just simply say the details are so accurately expressed on the plate that it becomes unnecessary to particularize them here. He ditches the taxonomic work. Sowerby's done enough, but the name on the spine is always Shaw. And then, of course, a person of significant impact and influence on Sowerby, and Sowerby on Smith, that's part of my thesis, is James Edward Smith. Let's just quickly look at the two of them. Sowerby was not wealthy. Smith was very wealthy. Sowerby had a pretty short school education and then went on, as I said, to the Royal Academy Schools. Smith was quintessentially the gentleman of the time. He was university trained. He went on a grand tour. Sowerby built up his own collections. Smith bought the Linnean collections and then established some of his own. Sowerby became early on a fellow of the Linnean and Geological Societies. Smith, fellow of the Royal Society and president of it. Sowerby was artist, teacher, businessman. Smith was a writer and a lecturer. Both were scientists, both were married. Sowerby had many children who he used later to help him do all the number of products, the publications and so on that he achieved. Smith had no children to disturb him in any sense. They did, in their collaboration, they did three things. All three of them have just Smith's name on the spine. The first was plants from Linnaeus' collections. He had the collection. It's a good idea to communicate about those. 75 black and white plates. Quite interesting book. The coloured figures of rare plants, which followed later, is, I think, much more impressive. It's just 18 fine coloured plates. He wrote to his friend Daval in Switzerland. He said, "I rejoice that you are satisfied with Sowerby. I like him much. I mean, he's an artisan, but I like him much. We are about a work of superb coloured plates. The title of the book is Coloured Figures." He's talking all the time about coloured plates, and it's dedicated to dear old Lady Rockingham, who we had work about the Lilium a little bit earlier on. He said in his introduction to Coloured Figures of Rare Plants, "I was induced to do this work by the persuasion of Mr. Sowerby, one of the best botanical draftsmen this country ever possessed." So it seems as though this was the whole raison d'etre. Here's a picture from it, an open spread. Another one is in the library, the Portlandia grandiflora. It's a pretty impressive coloured drawing when you look at it. But Lady Rockingham was pretty impressed by this. She liked big drawings, fine plants. And so she wrote to Smith, interestingly not to Sowerby, to Smith. And if he paints flowers equally well upon vellum as upon paper, she might possibly prefer it. The Missouri Botanical Garden refers to these plates on its website at the moment as these are some of his most accomplished work. I think that volume, how we call it Smith and Sowerby, is a great achievement. The third one was Gleanings of Botany in 1792, some rather fine Sowerby illustrations again. But then they moved to a declared open partnership, as it were, well, initially not open for both of them, English Botany that I mentioned right at the beginning. This is the opening plate of the Lady Slipper Orchid in English Botany. Smith didn't really want to be associated with this because he was unsure of the quality and whether it would sell well. But it soon sold well. it had, for those days, each issue sold about 500 and later 900 copies. That's remarkable in those days. Fortunately, we're able to see from the archives of the NHM some of the ways in which the work was done. So this is the original drawing, coloured in parts, with some notes from Smith. He would send, Sowerby in London would send this to Smith in Norwich for comments. And these are some comments, you probably can't read them there. And this is the final plate. Here's another one where actually Smith is saying this bit here is too sharp and these should be a bit more purple. So the two of them are working together on English Botany. And that's the final plate of this ericaceous plant. Now, the English Botany is a wonderful book, or wonderful 36 volumes, because it tells you a lot about the social life, about the people that contributed to it. This was a network. There were those sort of there were few botanical departments at universities and Chelsea Physic Gardens and so on. This gave you the taxonomy, it gave you the location, it gave you the uses. Even of many cryptogams such as this moss, life size at the top, the detail of it at the bottom. It's wonderful stuff. I hope you would agree with that. But interestingly, of course, it was like a work in progress all the time. And so it was no surprise really that when Sowerby received a letter one day from the Reverend Charles Abbott, he says, "Pray remember me for some plant in English Botany as soon as you can, as Mrs. Abbott likes to see my name in that book." However, I don't know quite whether Mrs. Abbott knew this, because 1 month later, there's another letter in the archive. "I candidly own it is my wish to appear as often as possible in English Botany." The early days of celebrity. But Sowerby really wanted to kick off on his own. He had done a lot of work being just commissioned without his name anywhere. Now he wanted to achieve something on a particular area that hadn't really been very well covered, I would argue, in, as it were, the broader botanical world, and that is fungi. He established his own museum to do that, as I'll mention in a minute. The other three areas that I'll quickly skim through is for British animals, then British mineralogy and exotic mineralogy, fossils and work entitled mineral conchology. But he was very innovative in producing 200 life-scale models of fungi, which, some of which reside still in the Natural History Museum, made of pipe clay and other materials. Pretty wonderful things. And these were really for educational purposes. Here's the dog stinkhorn, and here's some nice coprinus. I think these models are very impressive, and it's a pity in a way that they're sort of tucked behind the scenes. And for this, he established his own museum, built his own museum to which the public could come. And that museum contained these. It contained his herbarium, it contained many rock specimens, meteorites, some material in spirit, fossils, and so on. But then he was taking rather a long time to make these 200 models or so, and he decided to publish his own coloured figures of English fungi. And this is another magnificent 3-volume work of 440 hand-coloured plates. It's very impressive. And 200 species were named by him. He was a full-scale active scientist doing the taxonomic work. And it's lovely the way he sometimes says how he has actually given names to species. So for an Agaricus hybridus, he says, it just simply partakes a little of the characters from other agarics. I have therefore named it hybridus. He also reports on experiments that he did with his friends on eating fungi. Akins at first merry as if in high spirits from liqueurs, afterwards sick, eaten at dinner time. Poor friends. I think that personally, I'm not sure whether all mycologists, as it were, in the audience, but I think the illustrations are pretty magnificent. It's not easy, I don't think, to paint candle snuff fungus or trumpet de Moor or, again, some coprinus. They're beautiful works. They're very expensive. Bow Windows Bookshop in Sussex is selling the 3 volumes for £11,000 at the moment. And he also reports, too, about his own sensitivities. He was a man that was very aware of nature. And so he says, I gathered these on the delightful Mount Edgecombe, where I had the most elevated pleasure I ever felt in my life, in contemplating the sublime ways of Providence. Every aspect, hill and dale, bespoke its contrivance, a charming lesson for mortals, that naught has made in vain, or not for admirable ends. And then he turned his attention to animals again. He'd done the work for Shaw and others, but here he produced something rather intriguing, his British Miscellany starting in 1804, which were new discoveries, as well as some material that he had in his own museum. And the first one is Mesopodon bidens, a new whale that's discovered in Scotland by Mr. Brodie, who was a member of Parliament. And he also was a keen naturalist, and he involved Sowerby in the description and sent him the head, the skull, for his own collection, which was then housed in his museum in Lambeth. It's now in the Oxford Museum of Natural History, and here it is showing the fact that it's unusual because it's got these two teeth in the lower jaw. And in fact, it's still referred to in the press or in zoological journals as Sowerby's whale. He was the person that described it. That's the type specimen. And there are a few other specimens in his British Miscellany that were described by him, so he now had credentials as something of a zoologist. Here's just a simple other illustration. And then there are even the more detailed ones, such as this parasite on a sprat-like fish. The parasite is delving into the back of the eye and sort of harpoon structure of this fish, together with sort of the muscular area behind the head. It's a copepod. And I was quite intrigued in the description and whether this was any good, because he named this, and the name apparently still holds, as it were. So I wrote to the authority on copepods, an old colleague of mine, Jeff Boxall, at the Natural History Museum, sent him the stuff and said, what do you think? He sent back quite a long explanation saying this is really jolly good stuff. In fact, it just summarized at the end. So Sowerby was certainly an accurate observer and excellent illustrator of what must have been a rather unfamiliar animal at that time. And he still can use the illustration to distinguish it from other closely related copepods. While all this was going on, of course, remember, please, that he was a sort of artisan having to learn his business, so suddenly he gets a parcel in the post with an owl in it. And the attached letter, I shall be much obliged to you to have the Strixotus well stuffed and set up for me. No time should be lost. There is a man in St. Martin's Lane, presumably a taxidermist. The bird is not only very rare, but very interesting in all its parts. It was shot on Monday, and no time should be lost. And I don't doubt that Sowerby was obliged. Presumably the Reverend Bale wasn't too worried that he had shot a very rare bird, but never mind. And then came the British Mineralogy that I referred to right at the beginning. 5 volumes, 550 hand-coloured plates, followed later by Exotic Mineralogy, the 2 volumes. Fortunately, we can see some of the specimens that Sowerby used because they're in the Natural History Museum from his own collection. Here's crocodile, a lead chromate. And there's his drawing together with crystallographic detail. It's all quite accurate, it's good. He was the network centre for mineralogists in the country. There was nobody else that really they could send material to, exchange specimens or learn about them. Here's some interpenetrant twins of fluorite with some lovely small crystals of quartz growing on it. Here's just an amorphous but rather attractive mass of agate. Or here he's looking at rock specimens such as the intriguing Cotham marble with its patterns of manganese and iron looking almost like landscapes. But then of course the community at that time, you know, the botanists and so on were perhaps a bit miffed that Sowerby was not spending so much time on botany. Benjamin Foster, a mycologist, wrote to James Smith, I suppose you've seen Mr. S.'s Mineralogy. If he goes on as he's begun, when will the work finish, and where is the library that will hold the volumes, or where the purse that will pay for them? I should suppose upon a very moderate computation he might pave a footpath with his pebbles, oars, etc., from our house at Walthamstow to yours in Surrey Street. But how much of that was in jest, or feeling that Sowerby was going out on his own, I don't know. But British mineralogy is a huge achievement, and there is no comparable work then or yet or now. And then he turned his attention, because he wanted to do all natural history. There was no sort of compartmentalization that he would just favor alone. He turned his attention to fossils at a particularly important time, of course, when William Smith was preparing his map, as it were. Gideon Mantell was down in Lewis, busily working on the strata and discovering iguanodon and so on. And he published his mineral conchology with the assistance of his two sons, James Sowerby and George Brettingham Sowerby. And here is the first plate of some Nautilus, gathered from the London clay in Highgate in North London. The book is, again, just a straightforward taxonomic book. If you go into the Natural History Museum Paleontology department tomorrow, you'll probably actually see a curator walking around with this book in his or her hands. It's still useful, and it is also beautiful and attractive to my eye. Because if you look at the work, you see he's not just concerned with drawing a pretty picture. He's actually concerned with the taxonomic detail, giving attention to the nature of the hinge of this bivalve and of the muscle indentures and so on. Here we have a species of ammonite, Ammonites coniberi. This is the original specimen in the Natural History Museum. Here is Sowerby's drawing. And we also find that not only has he given us a drawing and given us taxonomic detail, he's also told us why, in his first description of the species, he's named it such. He named it after the Reverend William D. Coniberi, who, he says, whose zeal deserves to be remembered by posterity. He also actually named another ammonite, Greenoffii, because the president then of the Geological Society, Greenoff, impressed him so much by apparently the suavity of his manners. He also commented too on the elegance and beauty of these things. So on one ammonite species, he writes in Mineral Conchology, there is a peculiar elegance to this species that makes us regret its rarity. The fine sharpness of the sinuated edges of the septa is beautiful. Well, that's really it, ladies and gentlemen, except I just want to tell you that I've only been able to skim over a few things, mainly his output of work. But there were a lot of other things that I could have described and talked to you about this evening. There was the great debacle in the production of Flora Graeca, and how Sowerby had to be involved with that and the problems of its magnificence almost. That's a story almost in itself. There's the story here of His Majesty's ships, the Queen Charlotte, which was launched in 1810. Remember that we got the Napoleonic Wars. This was a man of war going out to fight the French. By the time it got to Plymouth in 1812, it was so rotten that there had to be major repairs, and it cost almost nearly as much to repair it as it did to make it in the first place. Sowerby was suddenly called help us. He was a mycologist, probably one of the best mycologists in the country at the time. He was summoned, he did a report, and I'll leave the story there, except to ask the question, was he ever paid? Were the minutes of the Navy Board changed in any way to cover the backs of the Navy Board? Was the civil service as good then as it might be now? Those are some of the stories that Sowerby was involved with, and there's some intriguing reading to be had there. He reported on some of this to the Linnean Society and again did some rather intriguing drawings of fungus that are associated with wood rot. And then there's, of course, the celebrations at the end of the war, the end of the Sixth Coalition, when dignitaries, including the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, came to London to celebrate the ending, basically, of Napoleon. And one of the innovative things that Sowerby decided to do was to take a piece of his rather fine Cape of Good Hope meteorite, shown here on the left in his drawing in Exotic Mineralogy, and fashion it into a sword, a meteoritic sword, which he presented to the Tsar of Russia with suitable inscriptions saying that these heads of Russia are jolly good chaps, basically. There's the story then of how it was fabricated, how it was presented, how it was lost, how it was found. I haven't been able to tell you about that. But the important thing too is that Sowerby was able to amass quite a reasonable collection of meteorites. And in his book on mineralogy, he was able to help resolve some of the problems about their origin. This one, the Wold Cottage meteorite, which is the largest to have fallen in Britain, is now one of the 100 treasures of the Naturalist Museum, and you can see it in the gallery just behind Charles Darwin there. And then there is this work that he did on colour. He wanted to try to quantify colour so that if he could say colour number 649 or something is the colour of that daisy, or the leaf of the daisy. And he did a lot of work which was basically in honour of the late Isaac Newton to try and get a quantitative colour scheme. That is another intriguing story of his sort of consideration towards trying to quantify natural history. Here is his colour chart. It's on display in the library. And then in 1816, he had his portrait painted. You can see him there with his colour chart just above the knee. The Wold Cottage meteorite is above that. His works, bound volumes, next to the meteorite. Perhaps he knew that he was coming towards the end of his productive career. He did carry on with his sons producing a new major work, the Genera of Recent and Fossil Shells from 1821 onwards. That in itself is a pretty acclaimed taxonomic masterpiece together with fine, beautiful illustrations. But that was just started 1 year before his death. And then when he did die, Sir Thomas Cullum to James Smith wrote, "Alas, poor Sowerby is no more. What a lost science." That was the only sentence he wrote. And yet, of course, the loss of him personally, as it were, but the achievement that he had continues to live on forever, I think, because there is so much of value in terms of its taxonomy, in terms of its beauty. And I would therefore like to say to you, I believe that I've been very privileged to write this first full biography of James Sowerby, and I hope that you see the fact that he needs to have a reappraisal and was one of the principal contributors to science at that time. Thanks very much.